Hello, my name is Dr. Ekua Agha. I have just completed my doctoral thesis on Ousmane Sembène's films and literary works at Birkbeck, University of London. I am also an associate tutor in the Department of English, Theatre and Creative Writing, also at Birkbeck. It is a pleasure to present aspects of my work on Ousmane Sembène. Creating new spaces for African women's voices in God's Bits of Wood. The late Senegalese writer and filmmaker Sembène Ousmane wrote the novel Les Bouts de Bois de Dieu in 1960. The book was then translated into English in 1962 as God's Bits of Wood. The novel, set in colonial French West Africa, is an illustration of how African writers like Sembène use their oeuvres to challenge colonialism's negative misrepresentations of Africans, their cultural values and beliefs. The scramble for Africa was also the most active period of colonialism, which involved several European countries. The major players included France, Germany, Great Britain, and Portugal. This presentation will focus briefly on France's colonizing mission in West Africa, where the novel is set. In 1854, Major Commander Louis Faidherbe and his army took control of a small Senegalese island and renamed it Saint Louis. By 1885, the French administrators had annexed Dakar, north of Saint Louis, then Rufisque, the port to the east of Dakar, and finally Dakar. Dakar would later become the capital of French West Africa. In addition to annexing these major cities in Senegal, the French authorities had also constructed a railroad referred to as the Dakar-Niger Railway, connecting Dakar to Mali. France's conquest and domination of Senegal is typical of colonial conquests. Modern colonialism aimed to transform non-European spaces and territories into fundamentally European constructs. Colonial administrators embarked on a mission to transform African spaces into European areas. This project to dominate rested on the notion that European culture was far superior to African culture. The colonial authorities argued that Africans were primitive people who needed the authority of civilized Europeans. Moreover, since theirs was an advanced culture, the discourse asserted that European men and women were racially superior to African men. In addition to this, Western discourse separated African men from women who were depicted as backward, unintelligent, and strange beings. This theory of Western cultural supremacy, referred to as colonial discourse, was embedded into France's colonial policy in Africa. Most importantly, this is how the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized was established during the colonial period. As I have been arguing, colonialism's project was to dominate the land and exploit the people. One of the methods of achieving this was by cultural devaluation. The rest of the presentation will focus on how women, particularly those from working class backgrounds in Senegalese society, were affected by colonial discourse. In colonial Senegal, women were systematically excluded from the center of socio-economic and political actions. One way of making sure they had no access to economic and political power was by denying them the rights to colonial education. Thus, only the sons of African chiefs were educated in the colonial schools, and men from working class backgrounds were employed to work in the colonial administration as clerks or laborers on the railroad. In the novel God's Bits of Wood, the action takes place in colonial Senegal, where the men from traditional working class backgrounds are working on the Dakar-Niger Railway, whilst the women stay in the family compound to take care of household matters, particularly the children, who they refer to as God's bits of wood. In the novel, the men employed on the Dakar-Niger Railway are embarking on a strike. The African workers were demanding for equal pay because they realized they were earning less than their French counterparts. During this period, the men were engaged in meetings and debates on how to confront the French administration. As a consequence, women were excluded from these discussions because the men assumed their wives, sisters, and mothers had nothing to contribute to the strike action. These women had no choice but to step aside, wait and watch, while their husbands' wages were stopped by their bosses, who were French men. It was indeed possible for the French officials who managed the railroads to exert socio-economic power on the strikers who were demanding for equal pay. It is also important to add that Sembène based his fictional novel, God's Bits of Wood, on the actual Dakar-Niger rail workers' strike of 1947 to 1948. Whilst the men were demanding for improved conditions, Sembène's inclusion of dialogue in the novel enables the reader to understand why the French authorities refused to dialogue with these men. In the novel, Sembène's inclusion of characters and dialogue is very effective. In this way, he reveals to the reader the day-to-day realities facing the colonized during this period. In a particular scene, the conversation between the French officials can be examined as Sembène's method of revealing the colonizers' negative misrepresentations of Africans. The dialogue takes place in the home of one of the French officials, the Isnards, who lived at number 7 between the villas of the Victors and the Leblancs. Pierrot, the newcomer, asked Madame Leblanc how he could get to meet one of the native families. Madame Leblanc, who had lived in Senegal for years, immediately responded to Pierrot, stating that he had nothing to gain from meeting them except lice, or one of their diseases. In the same conversation, she tells Pierrot how she could not believe how these half-savages had the effrontery to go on strike. Still not satisfied with her derogatory comments about the African workers, Pierrot asked Madame Leblanc to fill him with more details because that's exactly what he would like to understand. Madame Leblanc, who has been conditioned to believing in colonial ideology, continued to use racist discourse throughout her conversation with Pierrot. She told him categorically that there is nothing to understand. They are children, that's all. Somebody has just put some wild ideas in their heads, but they'll see sooner or later this strike is going to cost them a lot more than they can possibly gain from it. Although the African women were at the margins of the actions, they were aware of the situation, particularly as the economic impact of the strike was affecting their families. In the novel, Sembène creates a storyline propelling the women right into the center of the dramatic action, which was the strike. Sembène's storyline centers around the family compound, which has always been the women's territory when the men are away at work. We are introduced to Ramatoulaye, the wife of one of the strikers, who finally takes matters into her own hands during the strike. She decided to kill Vendredi, her brother's goat, Elijah Mebogo's goat, in order to feed her God's bits of wood. We're told that even though people were starving during this period, nobody had dared touch this goat, even though El Hadji was disliked by his own people for collaborating with the French. Hearing the news that his sister had killed a goat, El Hadji informs the police. Within a couple of hours, 2 police officers arrived to arrest Ramatoulaye. The African policeman was on hand to translate Wolof to his French counterpart as they embarked on their mission. Sembène's adherence to the aesthetics of African oral traditions like storytelling, dialogue, repetition, characterization, and humor becomes very evident in the scene. Ramatulai moves from the margins to the center of the drama. She identifies herself and confronts the white officer, ordering him in broken French to go away. She becomes very defiant and addresses the crowd of people, including the other women who could hardly believe that Ramatulai could confront the white officer. Ramatulai becomes the spokesman for the entire community as she began to recount the impact of the strike action on the women and their families. I know, Vendredi does not live here. He ate our rice. I killed him. The children were very hungry. Vendredi ate our children's rice. I'll come with you, but Vendredi does not come. Vendredi will be eaten. As the women stood in awe of Ramatulai, they also began to wonder where she had acquired this energy. The omniscient narrator informs the reader that Ramatulai's determination to speak out and challenge the white officer was as simple as the woman herself. Her energy had been born beside a cold fireplace in an empty kitchen. The cold but decisive response to the woman's questions can be seen as Sembène's way of creating new spaces for women's voices in colonial and post-colonial African societies. Ramatulai's defiance also gave the other women courage as they moved away from the margins to join her. The narrator describes how, on all sides of her, the other women began brandishing bottles filled with sand, flat irons, and clubs of all shapes and sizes. In a few minutes, the group of policemen was completely encircled. Moreover, the demonstration spread from the street to the courtyard, and the other women, Mam Sophie, Benetta, Hudeambai, led the way, whilst the other women followed, picking up anything that could pass as a weapon. We're told that even the cat put out its claws and spat. I return to the point I made at the beginning of the presentation that Sembène Ousmane uses his works to challenge colonialism's misrepresentations of Africans and their cultural values. Sembène's inclusion of the African family as the site of anti-colonial action can be seen as his way of revealing how colonial and African patriarchal discourse attempt to repress women's voices. Thus, this deliberate creation of two male officers, one African and one European man, to arrest Ramatulai is an example of how Sembène uses dialogue and characterization to retell the story of oppression and violation of women's spaces. It is a well-known fact that during the colonial period, the family home had also been the only safe and trusted enclave for the colonized, especially women. An argument can be made that Sembène's skillful use of the aesthetics of African oral traditions enables him to place marginalized women at the center of the narrative because throughout the rest of the novel, their repressed voices become more vocal. In addition, the women become more visible outside the family compound to the extent that they earn the respect of their husbands and brothers who decide to include them in the strike action. As the women became entrenched in the strike action, they also earned the new title marchers. Moreover, as they almost reach the final stages of the march, the narrator reveals to the reader how the marchers, as people now call them, learned that they were rapidly becoming famous. The newspapers and even the radio had mentioned them. Sembène continued to write novels to challenge those who use the dominant discourses of colonial and post-colonial societies to exert socio-economic and political power over women. He also used his films to reach a wider audience. Thus, cinema enables Sembène to retell the stories of anti-colonial struggles from the main point of view of the marginalized. He maintains that African women's roles in the struggle for independence has been erased from European history. Sembène used every opportunity to pay tribute to the role of women in African societies. He takes the stance that The participation of women in the struggle for liberation has several levels, including the raising, the socializing of children, and preserving our culture. According to him, it's the fact that African culture has been preserved by women, and it's thanks to them that what has been saved has been saved. Thank you all very much for your participation.